fault. He provided the means for the future monarch to come back in time and to allow Hank Hall in the present day to become the monarch. And so despite the other heroes saying to Captain Adam, let's take care of this, the captain says, no, forget it. It's my responsibility. And he chases down the monarch. They have a fight in the sky, and just the combination of their respective power sets clashing with each other causes a large enough detonation that both Captain Adam and Monarch are hurled back in time to prehistoric times, the time of the dinosaurs. And on the last page, the final text box says, to be continued in Armageddon 2001 Alien Agenda. Now, folks, the outcry from the end of issue number 2 was pretty massive and pretty quick. Even today, if you go on different message boards, social media groups talking about comics, this is perhaps one of the most reviled stories in DC Comics history. In 1991, a lot of readers were saying, this sucks. First off, they were reading it in the context that this was a hastily cobbled together ending in light of the fact that a much better ending had been leaked. And DC felt that its hand was forced and had to come up with something different. So the leak itself played a role in fans' disgust over this. But what was more, fans were really disgusted with the idea that Hank Hall would become the monarch. I think a lot of fans at the time were expecting that an A-list character like Captain Adam would become the monarch. It would just create for that much greater an impact to see somebody on such a high level as Captain Adam taking the fall. And fans looked at the story, which was written by Daniel O'Neil, and said, it doesn't make sense for a guy like Hawk to become the monarch. Hank Hall was not a well-educated man. So how would he have the technical know-how to even operate the Monarch armor, let alone put together a doomsday device based on components from 1991? It's not like the older Monarch, before dying, left the present-day Hank Hall a user's manual and said, here's how you build this doomsday device. So it really didn't make sense that a person with Hank Hall's personality and level of intelligence would become the monarch. This also flew in the face of the Hawk and Dove annual, in which Hawk and Dove were categorically ruled out as the future monarch. They were the only two heroes who Wave Rider actually saw physically combating the monarch. And it seems that co-writer Carl Kiesel himself was rather perturbed by this development in the second issue. In an interview, Mr. Kiesel said, when I wrote Hawk and Dove, it was a love story. Then one day, Hawk killed Dove, and that was the end of the story. So that was something else that left a really bad taste in fans' mouth. This event actually led to the cancellation of a book, which was actually doing fairly good at the time. I mean, it had solid writers, and the Kiesels, it even featured some nice artwork by Rob Liefeld, at least in the beginning. You know, usually events end with new series coming out, and yet here, this event was actually resulting in the cancellation of a series and two characters being taken off the table and being put to the side. And a lot of fans really were not good with this. Now, as for my personal take on this issue, if I read this in the context of there being a leak which forced a last minute change, which doesn't really jive with the portrayal of certain characters leading up to the conclusion, it's certainly not the best story I've ever written. But putting that historical context aside, rereading this issue, I kind of enjoyed it. It wasn't a really poorly written issue. First off, for someone who doesn't know the background on this story, one might look at this and say, oh, this was really neat what they were doing. They were setting it up for Captain Atom, and then they just swerved us with this. That's kind of neat. In terms of Hank Hall's turn as the Monarch, yes, there's certainly a case to be made against Hank Hall being a suitable candidate to be the one to become the Monarch, but I can also see why Hank Hall would actually make a at least somewhat viable replacement for Captain Atom in this role. First off, we're seeing a Hank Hall who is emotionally beaten. Thanks to that neurotoxin, he's not able to step in and save his partner, so he has to watch her die. Yes, Hank Hall lost his original partner. The first stuff was Don Hall, Hank's brother. And yes, Hank didn't have a psychological breakdown after seeing his brother die, but the circumstances were different. At the end of Crisis, Don Hall died gallantly, saving people in the streets. Here, Dawn Granger wasn't given a chance to defend herself. She was still mostly paralyzed, and she was just routed by the Monarch. And on top of that, Hawk loved Dove, and probably much more than a platonic level. So I can see why Hank would have such a huge breakdown, and why he would look at what happened and say, okay, yeah, the woman I loved is gone. I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to her. I'm not going to let this happen again. Clearly, going off half-cocked, going around just beating people up isn't enough. There actually has to be some order. So that's my take on the story. I'm, somewhere in between. I see both sides of the argument around this book. And of course, something else which really angered fans about the way the story ended was the fact that it led into another mini-series. Not an event, but still another story. And, today comics readers are conditioned to understand that a major event will not have a definitive ending. It just leads into the next story arc or the next year's worth of stories. But in 1991, there was still the expectation amongst the fandom that an event would have a definite ending to it. There will be a resolution. And then if you want to continue reading about the aftermath, that was on you to figure out which books to target to see how things changed for different characters following the event. But here, given that the original ending was leaked, there was a last-minute change, which was probably not entirely well thought out. It was just adding insult to injury by saying to fans, hey, come on and check out another Armageddon story. So I can only imagine a lot of the fans in 1991 saying, yeah, really? I don't think so. But DC went ahead with not one, but two miniseries. There was Armageddon Alien Agenda, in which Monarch and Captain Atom had a giant goose chase throughout time. And there was this malevolent alien species that wanted to take control of the Earth, and they tried striking a deal with Monarch in order to help him get back to his time. And it was up to Captain Atom to make sure that that deal didn't go through. In the end, Captain Atom was hurled back to the present day while Monarch was considered MIA. The big message that DC appeared to be forcing down readers' throats was, all right, guys, Hank Hall, Monarch, he's a really bad guy. And Captain Atom, he's a really great guy. I read Alien Agenda good 10 years after it first came out. And even then, I felt that that message was being applied a little too thick by DC. And evidently, fans didn't buy into it. And that's what led to Armageddon Inferno, which, aside from the title and some participation by Wave Rider, really had nothing to do with the original event. Basically, in this four-parter, a group of demons are trying to invade the Earth, and so Wave Rider helps the heroes of the DCU form different groups, strike teams to take down the demons. It ends with the demons being consigned to Limbo, where they engage in the never-ending battle against Loki and his forces to prevent the coming of Ragnarok to our plane of reality, in turn freeing the Justice Society of America and allowing them to return to our reality. And there's this really feel-good ending and the conclusion of Inferno, in which the JSAers meet up with their counterparts in the JLA. This was basically DC saying to fans, hey, we're really sorry about 2001 and Alien Agenda, so we're going to give you something which we really didn't want to give back to you. Here's a JSA. So we're sorry. Just forget about the stuff that came over the last 3 or 4 months, so don't you? And, fans might have taken this as a sign of honest goodwill, were it not for the fact that within 3 years, DC did another about-face and once again tried to bury the JSA. Actually, I would say they didn't just try, they were completely successful with 0 Hour. So, there you go. A really sad ending to this. A story which had a really neat concept, really neat promise, found a way to take summer annuals and give them added meaning. It was sad that it just ended this way, with such a strong sense of distaste in readers' mouths. And it would lead to this whole period of rehabilitation for at least 2 characters, which really unfolded over more than a decade. And if I were to take another look at 0 Hour from beginning to end, I would spend a lot more time talking about that theme of rehabilitation. So I'm going to talk about it here as it relates to the Monarch and to Wave Rider. I'll start off with Wave Rider because it was a much shorter rehab for the character. Basically, in 0 Hour, Monarch, who had become extant by this point, kills Wave Rider, absorbs his energy, and becomes this combined Hank Hall, Hawk, Monarch, extant character. And so the younger Matthew Ryder of our timeline agrees to undergo a procedure which